are known to be docile, compliant, and easily influenced. They seem to just mindlessly follow their herd without thinking. But one sheep from New Zealand, who was named Shrek, dared to be different. In 1998, a sheep farmer from New Zealand got up early one morning and headed down to his shearing shed to give his flock their annual haircut. And one by one, the sheep would come in, and the farmer would expertly shear off their wool coats and send them back out to the pasture. But unbeknownst to this farmer, Shrek decided he didn't want a haircut. And in fact, he didn't want a haircut ever again. And so while his fellow sheep were marching down to get their wool cut, Shrek secretly walked to the back of the pen, snuck out the back gate, and ran away up over the hillside without anybody noticing. And when he was finally out of sight of the farm, he just kept on running until he found this cave high up on this mountainside that he could hide inside of. At first, the farmer didn't even realize Shrek was missing. He had many sheep to take care of, and so it was easy to lose track. But eventually, he did catch on, and he went out looking for Shrek, but he couldn't find him. And so eventually, he had to just accept that Shrek was gone. 6 years later, in 2004, this farmer was out walking around the hillside a couple miles away from his farm when something moved in the corner of his eye. And so he turned and looked uphill, and there, perched on a rock, standing proudly, was the most absurd-looking sheep he had ever seen. It was Shrek, and he looked like an enormous brown cotton ball. Wild sheep will shed their wool every year, but domestic sheep, like Shrek, just continue to grow wool every year until it's sheared off. But during Shrek's 6 years he spent living in this cave, he never got a haircut, and so his fleece just continued to grow and grow and grow, and by the time it was finally sheared off, it weighed 60 pounds. His fleece contained enough wool to make suits for 20 large men. Shrek shot to fame immediately. He was sheared live on New Zealand's national television, and his fleece was auctioned off to help raise money for a children's hospital. Shrek met the Prime Minister of New Zealand, and he became the subject of many children's books and made dozens of charity appearances. 2.5 years after his first live television event, Shrek was sheared again on live TV, this time off the coast of New Zealand on an iceberg, again to raise money for charity. Shrek would spend the next couple of years touring the country before settling down back at his farm, where he eventually died of old age in 2011. To this day, he is still considered a national treasure. In 1982, a young boy named Leandro was living in southern Brazil with his family. One morning, he got up and went downstairs in his house, and he began looking for his beloved family pet, a tiny young red-footed tortoise named Manuela. The first place he looked was the back room of the first floor, where Manuela spent most of her time, but she wasn't in there. So he decided to search the rest of the first floor, where Manuela was allowed to free roam, but rarely did. But after looking around, he still couldn't find her. He knew she was too little to climb up the stairs to the second floor, so he figured she had to be hiding somewhere on the first floor, so he ran into his kitchen where his family was getting ready for the day, and he enlisted their help to go looking for her. Within an hour, they had turned the entire house upside down and had made their way out into their backyard, but there was still no sign of the little tortoise. And so while Leandro and his siblings were running around their backyard yelling out for Manuela, their father called them over and told them that unfortunately, Manuela was gone. Most likely, she slipped out of one of the doors that had been left open and had found her way into the nearby forest that butted up against their property. Leandro and his siblings begged their father to go looking for Manuela in the forest, but he told them that because she was so small, it would be nearly impossible to find her. Leandro was crushed, and he just prayed that someday that little tortoise would come back to him. 30 years later, in 2013, Leandro and his siblings were now grown adults and had moved out and had started lives of their own. But in January of that year, their father passed away, and so the kids decided to go back to the family home and clear out some of his old possessions. The father was a bit of a hoarder and was always on the lookout for old TVs and microwaves and furniture that other people had thrown away. And he would snatch these things up, he would bring them to his house and stuff them into his upstairs storage closet, promising his family he planned on fixing these things up. But he never did, and over time, as he collected more and more junk, that closet became so packed that Leandro's father couldn't even go inside of it, and so it was kind of just sealed off and forgotten about. Now that he was gone, the kids knew they would have to go in there and get rid of all that junk. They began hauling all of the stuff out and onto the curb for the trash collectors to pick up, and at one point, Leandro picked up a big heavy box that looked like an old record player, and so he brought it outside, he set it on his curb, and then he turned around to walk back towards the house when his neighbor, who had been outside the whole time, jokingly yelled to him, "Hey, are you going to throw away this tortoise too?" Leandro turned around, and there, poking its head out of the old record box, was Manuela the tortoise, happy and healthy as can be. 30 years earlier, Manuela had managed to climb inside of this old record box when their father had brought it home, and then the father brought that box upstairs and put it inside of his storage closet along with Manuela. Once she was inside this closet, Manuela just carved out a life for herself. She transformed the record box into her home, and she would leave it to eat termites and other insects and lick condensation off the walls. Red-footed tortoises are known for being extremely resilient. When food is scarce, they can go 2 to 3 years between meals. And if after that there's still no food, they can lower their body temperatures and other physiological processes and enter into this state of suspended animation that allows them to go even longer without sustenance. Because of this, it's no wonder that tortoises like Manuela live for at least 50 years on average. Leandro rushed over to Manuela, he scooped her up, he had missed her so much he could not believe he was looking at her again. And while Manuela had been doing just fine inside of her closet, she was no doubt very pleased to be reunited with her family. Most people don't realize just how smart crows are. In scientific studies, crows use logic to solve puzzles, and in one study, a crow was given a particularly challenging puzzle that required the understanding of analogies to solve it. And on this crow's first attempt, it immediately recognized the pattern and solved the puzzle within seconds. In the wild, crows will fashion their own tools, like a hook made from a bent twig that they'll use to help forage food more efficiently. Crows will also host these huge funerals for their fallen comrades. But the most fascinating aspect of a crow's intelligence is how they employ it against us. The same way we study crows, crows study people. They watch our behavior to look for patterns to help them determine if an individual is a friend or a foe. Once a determination is made, that crow doesn't forget, and they pass it off to their friends and their family, who will immediately put this information to use, even if they've never had a first-hand experience with the person in question. For the people who are determined to be the worst foes, like people who have tried to do harm to the crows have been known to stake out that person's house, and every time they come outside, they will swoop down violently trying to hit them, and they'll caw at them the whole time, and this behavior can go on for years. On the other end of the spectrum, the people who are determined to be the best friends of the crows get a very different treatment, one that seems like it's straight out of a fairy tale. In 2011, 4-year-old Gabby Mann was living in Seattle, Washington with her family. One day, when she was getting out of the family car, she dropped a chicken nugget onto the ground, and before she could pick it up, a neighborhood crow swooped down and took the free lunch. A few days later, when Gabby was on her back deck having some food, she dropped a piece of bread on the ground, and just like the last time, a crow came flying in and took it before Gabby could do anything. And because Gabby was a messy eater, she continued to drop food everywhere she went, and so she continued to inadvertently feed these crows. Eventually, every time Gabby went outside, a murder of crows would assemble in front of her house, so a big gaggle of crows, and they would just follow her around everywhere she went. As Gabby got older, she grew to really enjoy the attention from all these birds, and so she started feeding them huge portions of her lunch before she hopped on the bus to go to school. When she got back in the afternoon and hopped off the bus, there would be this murder of crows sitting on the power line waiting for Gabby. When Gabby's mother discovered where most of her daughter's food was going, she wasn't upset, she was just worried her daughter wasn't getting enough to eat. And so she told her daughter to stop giving away her lunch, and instead they would go out and buy some food just for the crows. And so, starting in 2013, when Gabby was 7, she and her mom began feeding the crows every day. Each morning they would go out into their backyard and they would refill the bird bath with fresh water, and then they would put peanuts into the covered feeder and scatter dog food in the backyard. And the crows loved it. A few weeks into this new feeding ritual, Gabby went outside one morning to refill the peanut tray when she noticed something was already on the peanut tray. There was a small earring. She brought it inside and she showed it to her mom, and her mom said she hadn't put it there, and so Gabby was convinced the crows had left her a gift. Her mom wasn't sure. But over the following few weeks, when more and more little trinkets like a marble and a polished stone and a screw and a metal hinge, when those started showing up in the peanut tray and in the bird bath, Gabby's mom actually went out and installed a camera to look out into the backyard to see if it was really true that the crows were the ones leaving these things behind. And after reviewing the footage, she was amazed to see that, yes, the crows would come in and they would eat their food, they would drink their water and clean themselves, and then they would leave behind these shiny little trinkets as if it was their way of saying thank you for the food. Gabby was over the moon for these little gifts. She began collecting all of them and putting them in a jewelry box and labeling them of when she got them and how important they were to her, ranking them from most favorite to least favorite, her favorite being this little piece of metal that said best on it, and she jokes that the crows have the other half that says friends. But the crow's most astonishing gift came the following year in 2014. Gabby's mother was an avid photographer, and one day she was out by herself photographing a bald eagle that had come into town. And while she was taking these shots, she managed to drop a lens cover to one of her cameras, and she heard it hit the ground, but she was so busy taking photos that she told herself she would pick it up before she left. But after getting totally wrapped up in this photo shoot, she forgot about the lens cap on the ground and wound up going home without it. That night, when she got back to her house, she happened to go out onto her back deck as the sun was setting, and she thought she noticed something in their bird bath. And upon closer inspection, she couldn't believe what was sitting there. She ran back inside and opened up her laptop and pulled up the footage from the bird camera she had set up, and there it was, a crow coming into the yard before she had even returned from this bald eagle photography session. This crow was in the backyard with the lens cap in its mouth, and it went into the bird bath and it very carefully washed the cap in the water, and then it placed it very delicately on the side of the bird bath and checked it a couple times to make sure it was steady, and then it flew off. This behavior is very significant because it means the relationship between the crows and Gabby and her mom was not a transactional one. They were not just simply leaving behind these trinkets as a way of paying for the food. They were doing it because they had grown attached to Gabby and her mom. So when Gabby's mom was out in town taking photos of this bald eagle, at least one crow had just gone with her. And when this crow saw her drop the lens cap, it snapped into action, swooped down, picked it up, and returned it to the house because that's what best friends do. Today, Gabby and her mother still feed the crows every single day, and the crows still love Gabby and her mother. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please patch the like button's leaking water tank with dollar store Scotch tape, not Flex Seal. The final confession at the end of this video is genuinely horrifying. Viewer discretion is advised. On September 12, 1982, two off-duty Alaska police officers were off hunting in a very remote section of Alaska about 20 miles away from Anchorage. The only way to get out to this area was by plane or by boat, and so generally speaking, the only people that came into this area were big-time hunters. After a long day, the two men realized it was starting to get dark and they were still deep in the woods, and so they decided it was time to turn around and start heading back to camp. The journey through the woods was challenging, and so the men walked down to the nearby Kinnick River and walked across an exposed sandbar. And as they walked, they noticed up ahead there was a boot sticking out of the sand. And as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a boot. There was also a human leg bone still in the boot. Being police officers, they knew the importance of not disturbing a potential crime scene, and so instead they marked on the map where they were, they left the area, and they reported the body to their department. The following day, crime scene technicians came out to that remote area, and they very carefully unearthed the remains, which still had women's clothing on them. And then afterwards, they began searching for evidence in the area, and eventually they discovered a single shell casing that was a .223 caliber round, which is a common caliber for hunting rifles. The remains were sent back to the lab for an autopsy, and it was revealed this person was a female, and she had most likely died at least 6 months earlier. And she had almost certainly been the victim of a homicide because she had died from 3 gunshot wounds. Also during the autopsy, it was discovered that there were no bullet holes on any of her clothing, and so it appeared that she had been shot without her clothes on, and then her killer presumably redressed her. Also, they found a hospital bandage wrapped up in her clothing that appeared to have been wrapped around her head, leading some to speculate that she had been blindfolded before she was shot. A couple of weeks after the autopsy, dental records came back, and they identified the body as belonging to 23-year-old Sherry Morrow. Sherry was an exotic dancer from Anchorage who had been reported missing 10 months earlier. In her missing persons report, it was stated that the last thing she told her friends was she had been offered $300 to have pictures taken of her by a professional photographer, and she was going to meet this man right before she disappeared. While police were fairly certain that Sherry's killer was this so-called photographer, they had no evidence that would allow them to search for this person. They had nothing. All they had was this shell casing that was commonly used amongst hunters, and there's lots of hunters in Alaska. So the police reported the finding of Sherry's body to the media in hopes that when they put that out to the world, that someone from the public would reach out with more information. During the police's press conference, one of the reporters asked them, do you think Sherry's death is connected to the other unsolved deaths in that part of Alaska? What they were referencing was 2 years earlier, 2 other women's bodies had been discovered in that rough area where Sherry had been found. One of the women was so badly decomposed there was no way to identify her. However, it was revealed she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. The other woman was able to be identified. It was 24-year-old Joanne Messina, who was an exotic dancer from Anchorage. But there was virtually no evidence at either of the 2 women's grave sites, and so their deaths remained a mystery. Publicly, at this press conference, the police told reporters that they did not believe Sherry's death was connected to those 2 other women. But privately, some officers had their suspicions. Not only had these 3 women met similar fates in a similar area, but over the past couple of years, there had been a significant increase in missing people out of Anchorage, Alaska. And most of these missing people were young women that were either exotic dancers or prostitutes. This convinced many officers that they were dealing with a serial killer, but there just wasn't any evidence to actually prove it, so they couldn't come out and say it publicly. Over the following year, no new information came out about Sherry Morrow or the other 2 deceased women that had been found in that same area, and so all 3 of their cases just continued to languish. Meanwhile, more and more exotic dancers and prostitutes were going missing out of Anchorage, and no one knew why. Then, on June 13th, 1983, the police got a break. Early that morning, a man driving a truck turned onto a quiet Anchorage highway, and as he was making his way down the road, he saw up ahead on the side, there was this woman running towards him, screaming with her hands over her head, and she wasn't wearing pants or shoes. And so obviously he knew something was wrong, and so he pulled over, and as this woman is charging up towards him, he notices she has a handcuff on one of her wrists, and she appears to be a lot younger than he initially thought. She's probably in her late teens. And so she comes running up to his car, he unlocks the passenger side door, she flings herself inside without even asking for permission, she slams the door behind her, and then ducks down to keep her head out of the window, like she's trying to hide from something out there. Now, this man looked out and he didn't see anyone or anything, but he wasn't going to wait around for whatever it was she was scared of, and so he just made a gut decision to take this girl away from here. And so he peeled off and drove down the road, and the girl, who was very shaken up, couldn't even tell this guy what was going on. She just asked him to please drop her off at a nearby motel, and the man didn't ask any questions. He drove her to the motel and he dropped her off. The girl ran inside and up to her room, and when she ran inside, the motel receptionist sees this girl running in. I mean, she doesn't have her pants on, she's got a handcuff on, she looks terrified, and so she called the police. A few minutes later, the police showed up. They went up to this girl's room, they knocked on the door, the girl opened it up, and she was obviously very scared, and she allowed the police inside, and she told them her name was Cindy Paulson, and she was 17 years old. The police recognized this girl is terrified, she's not a threat, and so they removed the one handcuff that was still on her, and then they asked her, what happened? And the police officers would say her story was just horrible. But what stood out to them was not how disturbing the story was, it was how composed and brave this girl was as she told it. This is her story. The night before, Cindy was working the streets of Anchorage. She was a prostitute, and a car pulled up, and inside was this wiry, bearded guy with glasses who seemed kind of slight and harmless, and he asked to buy her services. And because she didn't view him as a threat, she agreed and hopped in his passenger seat, and as soon as she sat down, he reached over and put a handcuff on one wrist and then drew a gun on her and told her to be quiet. And then he drove her to this fairly nice neighborhood, pulled into a driveway, he got her out of the car and led her into this house, and he brought her along downstairs into the basement, where as soon as she got down there was a dim light, and she saw there was a chain swinging from the ceiling. And he strung her up onto that chain, and for hours he assaulted her. And then after he grew tired of doing that, he told her he was going to go take a nap, and when he came back, they were going to leave this house and go out to his cabin in the woods. At this point, she begged him to let her go, but he really didn't care. He just told her that if she made any noise or tried to escape at any point, he would have to kill her. And then he walked out of the room. And for the next several hours, Cindy remained chained to the ceiling with half of her clothes off, wondering what horrible thing was going to happen to her next. Eventually, her attacker came back in the room, and he untied her from her chain, and he walked her upstairs to his living room, where he very proudly showed her a number of hunting trophies he had, and he began telling her about how much he loved hunting and where he went hunting. And it was at this point that Cindy realized this guy has no intention of keeping her alive. He's shown her his face, his house, his car. He's told her about places he likes to go and things he likes to do. He's given her all this information about himself. She is a huge liability to him. And so it dawned on her that if she didn't find a way to escape, she was going to die. After the trophy tour, the man led Cindy back out to her car. He put her inside, and then he drove to a nearby small airport where he said his plane was. And so he pulled over to their hangar, he got her out of the car, and he put her inside of the plane. And as Cindy is sitting in the plane, she's watching this guy load gun after gun and bag after bag of what looks like military supplies into this plane. And so she knows that this is the moment. I have to escape right now, because as soon as this plane takes off, I'm done for. And so at some point when this guy went over to his car to get something and his back was turned to her, she jumped out of the cockpit of this plane. She fell to the ground. She got up and just began running out of the hangar. And she managed to get out of the hangar and began turning the corner and running towards this forest right as she hears this guy charging after her, screaming that he's going to catch her and kill her. And so she just keeps running for her life all the way into this forest, all the way to that highway, before she finally stopped and turned around and she saw the man had stopped following her. This is when she went onto the highway and she flagged down the guy in the truck who brought her to the motel. The police were shocked by her story. It sounded totally unbelievable, but she was so genuinely scared and so detailed that they believed her. And so they told her they would have to bring her to the hospital, and on their way to the hospital, she demanded they go back to that airport that she had been held at so she can try to identify the hangar she had been in, and hopefully the plane would still be in there. And so the police comply, they go into the airport, and Cindy points out the hangar she believes she was in, and when they get there, the plane she had been on was still there, but the man, her attacker, was not there. And so the police got out and they began taking down notes about the plane, its different tag numbers and what it looked like. And while they're standing there, the security guard from the airport came over because he saw the police cars, and he told the officers that the night before he had seen the owner of the plane they're looking at acting very suspiciously with something inside of his car. And so on a hunch, he had recorded that man's license plate number, and he gave that number to police. And so the police were able to use that license plate number and some of the numbers on the plane to figure out who owned both vehicles. And it was a local man named Robert Hansen who owned a very successful bakery downtown. After dropping Cindy off at the hospital, the police officers decided to pay a visit to Robert Hansen at his house. When they got there, Robert was actually pulling into his driveway right at the same time, and they saw his car matched the description that Cindy had given of his car. And then when Robert got out of his car, he matched the description that Cindy had given of her attacker. When Robert saw the police parked outside of his house, he immediately invited them over and said, what can I help you with? And the police said, we'd like to talk to you. Can we go inside? Robert invited them inside, and when the police went into his house, it matched the description that Cindy had given of his house with all the hunting trophies everywhere. And so they sat down and they asked him what he was doing the night before, and he said he had spent the night with some friends, and he had their contact information, and if you needed to talk to them, you could, but they would say he was with them. When the police asked if they could have a look around his property, Robert immediately consented and said, you can look anywhere you want. And so the police searched his property, but found no signs that Cindy had been attacked there. And so they thanked him for his hospitality and they left. Once they got back to their station, they checked in with Robert's two friends he claimed he was with the night before, and they each independently corroborated Robert's story, saying that yes, he was with them from this time to this time. And so it appeared, as unlikely as it seemed, that Robert was telling the truth. And so the police went back to Cindy and they said, are you sure that everything you told us is exactly as you remember it? You didn't exaggerate anything? This is the truth? And Cindy said, absolutely. And they said, okay, well, are you prepared to take a lie detector test to prove that you're telling the truth? And Cindy said, no. Now, it's unclear why she said no. Maybe it was a general distrust of the police, but either way, when she said no, it immediately cast an enormous amount of doubt on her story in the eyes of the police. And when Cindy started to pick up that the police really didn't believe her anymore, she got spooked and just left town. And after that, her case and Robert Hansen were largely forgotten about. But 3 months later, on September 2nd, all of that changed. On that day, a construction crew was doing some work on a backcountry road not far from where those 3 women's bodies had been found. And at some point, one of their machines uncovered some human remains. The police were called in, who pulled up the rest of the remains, and then just like in Sherry Morrow's case, when they looked for evidence around this new body, they found a single shell casing from a .223 caliber round. The remains were brought back for an autopsy, where it was determined that the body was female and she had died from several gunshot wounds. Using dental records, they were able to identify this woman as being 17-year-old Paula Goulding, who was an exotic exotic dancer who had gone missing 5 months prior from Anchorage. The police sent the .223 shell casing found in Paula's gravesite, along with the other .223 shell casing found in Sherry Morrow's gravesite, to a lab to be analyzed, and it was quickly determined that both of these rounds had been fired from the same rifle, and therefore both women had most likely been killed by the same person. This was the moment the police knew they were dealing with a serial killer, and many police officers wanted it to be Robert Hansen. He seemed like the guy, but he had a rock-solid alibi and they had no hard evidence against him. And so without any other suspects, the police turned to a famous FBI profiler, a guy by the name of John Douglas, and they asked him to build a profile of who he think killed Sherry Morrow and Paula Goulding. And when John's report came back, the police were shocked. The profile described a man in his 40s who blended in easily with society. He was well-liked and got along with people and was just a normal guy. And he was successful, probably because he owned a successful business. He was an avid outdoorsman and hunter, and he most likely had a significant speech defect, like a lisp or a stutter. The profile was perfectly describing Robert Hansen. And because of John Douglas's prolific success in correctly identifying killers based on his profiles, when a judge saw this particular profile and saw how neatly it lined up with Robert Hansen, he gave the FBI a search warrant for Robert's house. And this time they would find very damning evidence, like a map of the local area. It was a hunting map, and on it there were 37 X's marked off. And some of those X's coincided with the same area where those 4 women's bodies had been found. They also found a .223 caliber rifle, along with a bag of women's jewelry that contained a necklace belonging to Sherry Morrow. As the FBI was carrying evidence out of Robert's house into their truck, a neighbor walked over after seeing all the commotion, and she walked up to one of the agents, and she was very skittish and anxious, and she said, "You know, my husband, he's friends with Robert, and he recently pretended to be an alibi for Robert. He had no idea how much trouble he was in, and I certainly didn't know, but I want you guys to know that my husband was lying. He was not with Robert on the night that he said he was." This was the proverbial nail in the coffin for Robert Hansen, because now, without this alibi, he had nothing to hide behind. And so when the police approached Robert with their overwhelming evidence against him between what they found in his house and this now recanted statement from his former alibi, Robert said, "Okay, I'm going to confess." But there was a catch. He was only willing to confess to murdering the 4 women whose bodies had already been found by police. Now, the police knew Robert had almost definitely killed more people, and so at this point, they just wanted to know who the other victims were and where they were. And so they offered Robert a deal where he would confess to those 4 murders and then give additional information about other victims, where they were located, who they were, what happened to them. In exchange, they would not prosecute him on any other victims he named. And so Robert agreed to these terms, he signed the deal, and then he gave a full, horrifying confession. He said he would drive around Anchorage at night and look for young, vulnerable women that were all alone. These were usually prostitutes out on the street, or they were exotic dancers he would try to befriend inside of clubs. And when he approached these women, he would tell them he was a professional photographer and he thought they were beautiful and he wanted to take photos of them, and he would pay them for the photo shoot. And many of these women were aspiring models, and they were really excited at this idea, and so they would agree to go. And so Robert would tell them to meet him the next day at a particular location, which was usually a fast food restaurant, and Robert would show up much earlier and he would hide in his car and he would wait to see when they showed up if they were alone or not. And when he saw they were alone and they had no one to help them, he would drive up and he would ask them to get in his car. What these women couldn't see was on the inside of the passenger side door was a handcuff that was already latched on to the door itself, and there was an open cuff waiting for them as soon as they got in. They would get in the car, he would reach over them and act like he was helping them put on their seatbelt, and then as they're kind of looking at him, wondering what he's doing, he would grab their wrist, throw it in the open handcuff, and then he would draw a pistol and hold it against their head and say, "Be quiet." During his confession, Robert bragged to police that he had done this so many times, putting the handcuff on and drawing the pistol, that it was like muscle memory for him. Once he had the women handcuffed inside of his car, he would drive them back to his house and he would bring them into his basement and he would chain them up to the ceiling just like Cindy had described. And then after assaulting them for hours, he would take them out of his basement, put
them in his car, drive out to the airport. He would put them in his plane, but unlike Cindy, these women didn't escape. And he would take off and he would fly them out to his cabin, which was not far from where those 4 bodies had been found. Once he got the women into his cabin, he would undress them and put a blindfold on them, and then with their handcuffs still on, he would assist them out the front door and tell them to run. And they would. They would take off as fast as they could into the woods, running into trees, falling over, but just running for their lives, believing their ordeal was now over. They just had to get away from this guy. But what they didn't know is their ordeal was just starting. Robert had no intention of allowing them to escape. He knew there was deep water that surrounded his cabin, and so if they actually made it that far to the water's edge, they would drown. And so Robert would give these women a significant head start to give them the sense that they actually might escape. And then Robert would grab his knife and his hunting rifle, and he would head out and begin stalking his prey. And for the next several hours or days, he would walk around the woods looking for these women, and he would just stay off, watching what they were doing. And at some point, he would sneak up on them, and he would wound them intentionally, usually with his knife, and then he had a blood trail to follow. And he would follow these dying women who were screaming out for help, and at some point, these women would know they were going to die. There was no hope for them, and they would collapse or they would stop, and at that point, Robert would walk up to them and he would shoot them. Afterwards, he would remove their handcuffs, he would redress them, and then he would bury them in a shallow grave. Before he was carted off to prison to serve a life sentence without the possibility of parole, he was brought out by authorities to help identify where other grave sites were in that hunting area. But he was only able to find 8 additional victims because he would go to different grave sites and the remains would not be there anymore, most likely because animals had ransacked the area, or he just simply forgot where it was, or he didn't want to share any more information with police. Robert never confirmed if all 37 of those X's on that map that was found are actual sites of victims that he buried. But investigators say that's exactly what they were, and in fact, many believe there are other maps with more X's on them. But the police could only confirm 17 victims. If there were more, we probably will never know, because in 2014, Robert died in prison and he took those secrets to the grave. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly teach the like button's parrot to scream obscenities every time the like button is on a work call. In 1956, the SS Andrea Doria, which was a beautiful ocean liner, was considered to be Italy's largest, fastest, and safest ship. But those things would not be what this ship was remembered for. On July 25th of that year, the ship was sailing towards the east coast of the United States when it ran into some very heavy fog. And so, following procedure, the captain slowed the vessel down and turned on their fog whistle. A little while later, another vessel, the Swedish ocean liner called the SS Stockholm, entered the fog as well, but they were unaware of Andrea Doria's position. Now, both vessels were using radar, but unfortunately, both vessels misinterpreted what they were seeing, and so neither of them communicated with the other as they careened towards each other. When visual contact was finally made between the two ships, it was too late. A collision was imminent. At 11:10 p.m. that night, the bow of the Stockholm plowed directly into the side of the Andrea Doria, penetrating over 40 feet inside the ship before coming back out again. The impact killed 46 people on the Andrea Doria and 5 people on the Stockholm. When the story broke, every major news outlet around the world picked it up, including ABC News in the United States. And the news correspondent that they chose to cover this story was a man named Edward Morgan. And unbeknownst to his co-workers, his 14-year-old daughter, Linda Morgan, was on board the Andrea Doria. And just before he went on, he was informed that she was amongst the missing and presumed dead, and there was virtually nothing he could do but wait for more information. And so despite his incredible burden, Edward still went on the air and reported the story without ever losing his composure and without ever mentioning his daughter. But after he got off the air, another story began to develop about the crash. Apparently, a girl who was asleep in one of the rooms on the Andrea Doria that experienced a direct hit from the Stockholm woke up after the crash and didn't know where she was, and she began yelling out for her mother. Meanwhile, a man on board the Stockholm heard the girl's cries and he ran
ran towards the front of the stock home, which is where he heard these cries coming from, and when he got up there, he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Perched on the destroyed bow of the stock home was a bed, and on that bed was a relatively unhurt 14-year-old girl named Linda Morgan. It would turn out when the Stockholm penetrated into the Andrea Doria, the bow of the Stockholm scooped the bed Linda Morgan was on up and kind of dragged her into the ship, and then when it retracted out of the Andrea Doria, it brought that bed and Linda Morgan with it. When Edward Morgan found out that his daughter was the so-called miracle girl, he was overcome with emotions, and he would go back on the air, and this time he would talk about his daughter and her incredible survival story, and he would also talk about how hard it was to deliver the news when it was about someone he loved. Linda would make a full physical recovery. She only suffered from a broken arm, but she would suffer enormously from survivor's guilt as her stepfather and her half-sister were both killed in the crash. On April 27, 1997, a farmer in Indonesia was walking his livestock through a thick sugarcane field near his house when he tripped on something. After he regained his balance and looked down, he noticed a strange mound of dirt that seemed totally out of place. He wanted to dig it up just out of curiosity, but he wasn't on his property, so instead he walked back to the village and he told the village leader about this strange pile of dirt and suggested he see what's under it. So the village leader and some other men headed back out to the field. They find this dirt pile, and the first thing they do is they poke it with a stick. The stick went right into the pile. It was a soft pile of dirt, and when they pulled it out, this horrible stench filled the air that was coming out of this mound. Worried about what they might find underneath this pile, the men decide to leave it alone and go back to the village and tell authorities about it, and the authorities promptly tell them to go back out there and uncover this thing and tell them what they find. And so the village leader and some more men head back out to the field, and they start digging. And pretty quickly, their shovels strike something that's fairly soft inside of this mound. And so after delicately removing some more dirt, they discover a woman's face is looking right back at them. It appeared she'd been buried up to her neck, and then someone had just thrown dirt on top of her head. At this point, the authorities did come out, and they were able to identify the body as belonging to a 21-year-old local woman named Dewey. After asking around the village about this girl, the police determined the last time anyone had seen her was 3 days earlier when she had left her house to run an errand. But after that, no one knew what happened to her. Just a few hours after Dewey's discovery, a 15-year-old rickshaw driver came to the police with additional information. He said 3 days earlier, on the evening of April 24th, so the same day that people had seen Dewey last, he said she had come to him to ask for a ride. And when she got into the rickshaw, he asked where she wanted to go, and she said she did not want to tell him specifically where she was going. Instead, she just wanted him to drive in a particular direction, and she would give him more information about how to get where she wanted to go as they got closer. And so this really intrigued the driver, and so after he began going in this direction, he turned to her again and said, can you tell me anything more about where we're going? This is really weird that you're not giving me any more information. And so finally, Dewey relented, and she told him she was going to see the shaman. A shaman, in simple terms, is someone who uses magic to cure the sick. The driver did think it was odd that this girl was going to see the shaman in the middle of the night and she was being so secretive about it, but after he dropped her off, he hadn't given it much thought until he found out she had died. The police approached the shaman, who was 45-year-old Ahmad Siraji, and they asked him if he had been with Dewey on the night of April 24th. Initially, Siraji said no, he had not been with her, and he had no idea what happened to her. But after police searched his house and found Dewey's belongings inside, Siraji said, okay, I've been lying and I have a confession to make. And he would very nonchalantly tell police that not only had he killed Dewey, he had also killed dozens of other women the same way and buried them in the sugarcane field. And so the police went out to the field and started looking around, and they found all these mounds of dirt all over the place, and under them were women buried up to their neck. After the excavation was all done, the police believed they found the bodies of 42 different women, but truthfully, that was just a guess. They believed there could be more. During his trial, Siraji explained in detail why he did the things he did. He said back in 1986, so 11 years earlier, he had this vivid dream where his deceased father came to him and instructed him to drink the saliva of 70 women, and if he did that, he would become immortal. When Siraji woke up, he didn't chalk up this experience as just a strange dream. He believed he had just had a real interaction with the spirit of his dead father, and so he decided he would do as he was told. But his father didn't explain to him how he was going to extract the saliva from these 70 women. And so after thinking about it for a couple of days, Siraji decided the most efficient way to do it would be to just kill the women and then forcibly take their saliva. To find his victims, Siraji began telling people in his village that he had supernatural powers, that he was able to grant women specifically everlasting beauty and riches. And many people believed it. And so as this rumor spread not only around his village, but to surrounding areas, lots of women heard about it and came to him and requested his services. He would tell them to come back later that night when it was totally dark and to not tell anyone where they were going. Once they arrived, they would come inside of Siraji's house and they would pay him a fee that was roughly equivalent to $300. And then he would tell them he needed to perform a ritual to give them their beauty and their riches. And so they would leave his house, they would cut through a cemetery, and they would enter into that sugarcane field, and they would walk for a while until Siraji stopped them, and he would hand the woman a shovel, and he would tell her to dig a hole in the ground, and he would assure her this is part of the ritual. And so he would stand there as she dug the hole until it was about waist deep, and then he would tell her to get in the hole and put her hands by her side. If she was at all nervous, he would just reassure her again that this is all part of the ritual, that lots of people have done this before, that it's totally safe. And so she'd get in the hole, she'd put her hands by her side, Siraji would take the shovel and he would fill the hole back in until she was completely immobilized, and then at this point Siraji would pull out a cable, he would wrap it around their neck, and he would strangle them to death. And then once they were dead, he would pull their body out of the hole, and then he would forcibly extract their saliva. And then after that, he would take the shovel again and dig the hole a little bit deeper, and then he would put the body back inside the hole, making sure their head was still sticking out of the ground. And he would orient them so their face was looking towards his house, because he believed having these women constantly looking at him at all hours of the day gave him more power. He said as for Dewi, when she first came to his house and she had paid that fee, she was worried about leaving and going and doing this ritual. It scared her. And so Siraji told her to wait, and he went into the other room where his wife was, and he told her that, hey, I'm gonna go kill this girl and I need your help. I need you to calm her down. And his wife, who had no idea her husband was a mass murderer, just immediately went along with it. She came back into the room and she assured Dewi that everything was totally fine. They had done this before. It was all going to be perfectly safe. And she even said she would come with them to do this ritual. And so at this, Dewi was much more calm and she agreed to go. And so the trio left the house. They went through the cemetery out to the field, and then only 2 people came back. Siraji was executed in 2008 by firing squad, and his wife was sentenced to life in prison. Around midnight on September 3rd, 1986, Doug Wells and his wife Kristen were pulling onto their street in western Montana when they noticed a camper parked in front of their house. Neither of them recognized the camper, and so when they pulled into their driveway, Doug got out and walked over and looked inside to see if anyone was in there. And there was a man sleeping in the front seat. Doug didn't wake him up. Instead, he went back to his wife, they talked about it, and they decided that this man must have just randomly parked in front of their house, and that most likely the next day he would leave. And so the couple went inside their house and they began getting ready for bed. At some point, Doug rounded up all the trash inside of the house and was going to bring it outside to put into the trash bin. And when he went outside, standing in his front lawn is the same guy who was just sleeping inside of the camper. And so Doug very cautiously goes down the front steps and he yells out to this guy and says, what are you doing here? And immediately the man put his hands up and said he meant no harm. He said his name was Wayne Nance, and he actually worked with Doug's wife, Kristen, at the furniture store in town. Wayne went on to say that he happened to be driving down their street earlier that day, and he spotted someone standing outside one of their windows looking in their house, and he knew it was Kristen's house, and he looked in their driveway and he saw that Kristen wasn't home and it looked like nobody was home. And so he decided he would just park out front and try to scare off this person and wait for Kristen to get back. But by the time Kristen got back, he had fallen asleep. Doug was totally caught off guard by this whole situation. The idea that there's this guy on his property talking about another guy that was lurking around his property. And so he asked Wayne, did you see this guy again after that first time you saw him? And Wayne said no, he hadn't, but he didn't have a flashlight. And so maybe if Doug went in the house and got some flashlights, the two of them could walk the property and make sure nobody was there. Doug thanked him for the offer and said, okay, well, why don't you come in the house and I'll go look for those flashlights. And so Doug led the way inside of his house, and as soon as Wayne got in the house and shut the front door behind him, he pulled out a metal pipe he was hiding and smashed Doug over the back of the head. Doug turned around and Wayne hit him again over the face, and before long the two of them were struggling wailing on the ground. Kristen, who was upstairs, heard the commotion, and she came running down the stairs, and she sees at the bottom her husband, who's bleeding profusely from his head. He's covering himself up on the ground, while Wayne, her co-worker, is standing over him, punching and kicking him. Before Kristen could do anything, Wayne noticed her up on the stairs, and he drew a pistol and aimed it at her and told her to come down here and tie up your husband's arms and legs. Kristen, who's in shock, is just hoping this was just a robbery and that they would have their lives spared. And so she does as she's told. She walks down, Wayne throws her some cord, she ties up her husband's arms and legs, and then afterwards, Wayne leads Kristen back upstairs to the bedroom where he ties her up as well. After that, Wayne went back down to the main floor where Doug was still laying on the ground, and he grabbed Doug by the legs and he pulled him down the flight of stairs to the basement where he tied him up to a pole. And then he savagely beat him with the pipe before Wayne pulled out an 8-inch blade and plunged it directly into Doug's chest all the way in. And then when he pulled it out again, Doug slumped over. Wayne went back upstairs all the way to the second floor to check on Kristen, and he saw she had managed to get partially out of her restraints and she was reaching for the landline, and so he jumped on top of her and managed to restrain her all over again. And then after he was confident in her restraints, he went back downstairs to make sure Doug was dead. When he got down there, he saw Doug was still slouched over in the same position he had left him, and so Wayne assumed Doug must be dead, and Wayne went back upstairs to assault Kristen. But Wayne was wrong. Doug wasn't dead. And after Wayne went upstairs that second time, Doug, despite his horrific head and chest injuries, managed to wriggle out of his restraints and then hobbled over to a workbench where he had a rifle laying out because Doug was actually a gunsmith. And so he took the rifle and he loaded it with the one round he found on the table, and then he walked over to the base of the stairs, he raised his rifle, and he made his way up to the main floor. He didn't come in contact with Wayne, and he looked around the first floor, he didn't see him, and he heard his wife screaming upstairs. And so he made his way to the next set of stairs and began walking up with his rifle raised. At the top of the stairs to the second floor, there was a hallway that ran right and left out of sight. And so as Doug is making his way up, he can hear off to the left, out of view, his wife screaming in the bedroom, and he can hear the sound of very heavy footsteps running down the hall towards the landing where he is. And so Doug positioned himself in the stairwell, he took aim about chest height with his rifle, and he waited for their attacker to show himself. And so as soon as Wayne came flying around the corner with his knife in his hand, Doug just fired one shot that struck him right in the stomach. Wayne fell backwards, totally shocked at what had just happened. He began to stagger, and Doug, meanwhile, turned his rifle around like a baseball bat because he didn't have any more rounds, and he just starts walking down the hall, smashing Wayne as Wayne continues to stumble and fall and try to run away from Doug. And finally, he gets away from Doug, charges into the bedroom where Kristen is, and he grabs his pistol, and he turns around and he fires 3 shots towards the door where Doug is now standing. And Doug, he's unfazed. One round hits him in the leg, the other 2 miss. He doesn't care. He just walks up to Wayne and begins bashing his head in with the back of this rifle. He hits him so many times that the buttstock of the rifle explodes and the metal of the rifle bends like an L. And at some point, Wayne drops the gun because he's getting viciously beaten on by Doug and his rifle. And Doug sees that, he grabs the pistol, and he fires the remaining rounds into Wayne's head. Police and paramedics would show up shortly thereafter, and Doug, Kristen, and their attacker Wayne were all rushed to the hospital. Doug and Kristen would make full recoveries. As for Wayne, he would die the following day from his injuries. After the incident, the police investigated Wayne Nance to see who this guy was, and they discovered that almost certainly he had been a serial killer that was connected to at least 6 cold case murders from 1974 to 1986. But because Wayne never confessed to any of these murders before he died, the true number of people he killed is still unknown. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please secretly use the like button's toothbrush to clean a dog's teeth and then just put the brush back. Today's story is brutal. If you get to the end, it's the kind of story that's going to leave a mark on you. So viewer discretion is advised. West side of Ohio lies a small town called Wilshire. In 1989, there were less than 600 people that called this place their home, and virtually all of them were middle-class Americans. Most of them were farmers or factory workers, or they worked in one of the very few small businesses in town. While Wilshire was certainly not the most exciting place to live, it did have a reputation for being a nice place to raise a family. It was a tight community of people that looked out for one another. One family that was part of the Wilshire community in 1989 was the Rogers Rogers family. They consisted of the parents, Hal and Joan. Joan went by Jo, and they were both 36 years old, and they had two daughters, Michelle, who was 17, and Christy, who was 14. Hal and Jo had met in high school. Jo was very outgoing and popular, and Hal was reserved and quiet. But despite their extreme differences, they actually complemented each other very nicely, and they seemed to bring out the best in the other. By their senior year, Jo had become pregnant with Michelle, and so after graduation, the teen couple got married and they moved into a dairy farm to start their life together. And a few years after that, Christy was born and their family was complete. Over the years, Hal and Jo worked extremely hard on their farm, but it just wasn't enough to pay the bills. So to make ends meet, Jo had to get a second job working nights at a factory where she drove a forklift and worked the assembly line. While life was certainly not very easy for the Rogers family, they always found a way to stay positive and upbeat. The girls were very popular in school and made friends easily, and when they were home, they were always goofing around with the farm animals that they loved. As for the parents, they always carved out time every week where just the two of them could sneak off and get breakfast or dinner together. But their simple, happy way of life would be shattered later that year when it was discovered that Hal's brother, John, who actually lived with them in a trailer on their farm property, had secretly been assaulting Michelle for the past 3 years. Michelle hadn't told anyone because John had threatened to kill her, but when inappropriate pictures of her turned up inside of his trailer, his horrible secret was out. John went to jail for a very long time, but the damage he left behind was unbelievable. Michelle couldn't even talk about what happened to her. Meanwhile, Hal, her father, was just beside himself. He could not believe that right under his nose, someone was harming his daughter, and that it was his own brother doing it. He wanted to kill his brother, but his brother was in custody, so he couldn't. And making this situation even more painful, Hal and John's mother wound up siding with John. She believed Michelle was lying and had set John up, and she began saying this publicly, and it spread all throughout town. It was just an absolute tragedy through and through, and Hal and Jo had no idea how they were going to recover from it. That's when the idea of a vacation came up. Take the kids away from this farm, away from this drama, let them be kids again, let them be stress-free, even for a couple of days. It will do them an enormous amount of good. And so Hal decided he would actually stay back at the farm, and just Jo and the girls would go. It would be a girls' trip. When Jo told her daughters, they were ecstatic. They had never been on a vacation before, and in fact, neither had Jo. Jo told the girls that they needed to plan out this trip, pick the place they wanted to go, plan out the itinerary, but keep in mind, they had to drive wherever this vacation was going to be, and their budget was going to be fairly tight. The girls decided on Florida, and for weeks, they meticulously planned their itinerary, trying to maximize sightseeing opportunities both on the road trip and also at their destination. Finally, on May 26, 1989, the day had come for the girls to head out on their journey. They said bye to Hal, and then they loaded up into the light blue family sedan, and they were on their way. The trio drove south for about 8 hours on I-75 through Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, all the way to Georgia, which was their halfway point. They found a motel, they crashed there for the night, and then the next morning they got up early and they finished their trip all the way into Florida. And for the next couple of days, they followed their itinerary and went to amusement parks and zoos and other attractions all over the Sunshine State. They were really having a great time. In fact, on May 29th, Jo sent a postcard to Hal that she kind of jokingly said, "The girls are dragging me all over the state. All I want to do is relax." But the tone of the message was really that she and her kids were having a wonderful time. On June 1st, the girls left Orlando, Florida, and made their way to Tampa, Florida, where they planned to go to one more amusement park before they had to turn around and head back to Ohio. Hal had been told they would be back on June 3rd. But when June 3rd came and went, and the girls did not show up in Ohio, Hal was not immediately concerned. Hal was very restrained and composed. He almost never showed any emotion. So when things didn't go to plan, he didn't panic. He just assumed that Jo and the girls had decided to stay a little bit longer. They had each other and they would be fine, and he would see them in a couple of days. But over the next couple of days, the girls did not show up and they never communicated with Hal. And so on June 6th, Hal went to the police and he reported his family missing. The police investigation was slow at first because there was a general belief that these women had decided to just stay out longer because they didn't want to come back to this dairy farm that now was home to a lot of terrible memories after this revelation about their uncle. But 2 days after Hal went to police, everything changed. That morning, a motel maid in Tampa, Florida, noticed something odd about room 251. She had cleaned it earlier in the week and had made the beds and put the towels up and moved the occupants' luggage onto chairs and tables so it was nice nice and neat. And now she was coming back to clean it about a week later, and the room still looked exactly the way it did when she had cleaned it. The beds were still made, the towels hadn't been touched, and the luggage was positioned around the room just as she had set it up. So she tells her manager, who thought it was strange enough that he called the police and told them about it. The police in Tampa went out to this motel, and they discovered that room 251 was registered to missing people, Joan Rogers and her two daughters, Michelle and Christy. The motel manager told police that the trio had checked in on June 1st, but after that, no one had seen them. The police searched their room, and they found their camera, and the final two pictures that had been taken were taken inside this motel room. One was of Michelle crouching down, rummaging through her suitcase, looking like she's getting ready to go out somewhere, and the other was taken from inside their room, looking out over their balcony out towards Tampa Bay as the sun was beginning to set. The rest of the search of the room did not turn up any significant evidence. All they knew was the women were not there. And so using the motel as a center point, they began searching the area, and pretty quickly they found Joe's car parked a mile away from the motel near a public boat ramp. Joe and her daughters were nowhere to be found, and initially there was nothing inside or outside the car to indicate where they might have gone. But upon closer inspection, they found two brochures sitting on the floor of the car, and on each of them was some handwriting. The first brochure had a note that was clearly written by Joe, and it was directions to the boat ramp where the car was parked. On the other brochure, the other note, the handwriting was not Joe's or her daughter's. It was some other person's handwriting, and that one was directions to the motel where Joe and her daughters were staying. The police had no idea who wrote this second note, so they started by focusing on Joe's note, the directions to this boat ramp. Specifically, they were looking at the last couple of words in her note where she wrote blue with white. And investigators assumed what this meant was when she got to this boat ramp using these directions, she needed to look out for something that was blue and white. And what would be blue and white at a boat ramp? Boats. And that's when the police made a terrible connection. 4 days earlier, the Coast Guard had made a discovery out in the bay about 25 miles away from where Joe's car had been found. At the time, no one was connecting this discovery to the three missing women from Ohio because no one in Tampa knew about the three missing women from Ohio. But now that they did know about them, the connection was obvious. While it would take 3 years to finally put all the pieces together, the police would eventually figure out what happened to Joe, Michelle, and Christy. On the morning of June 1st, they got in their car and they left Orlando and made their way to Tampa. When they got to Tampa, they couldn't find their motel. So Joe pulled over on the side of the road and she got out her brochure that had a map of the area. And as she's studying her map, trying to figure out where she is, a man approaches the car. He was white, he was in his 30s, he was average height, average build, he had blonde hair and a mustache, and was just overall kind of unremarkable and unthreatening. And so he went up to the driver's side window, and Joe rolled her window down, and he said to her, are you guys lost? I see your Ohio license plates and you're pulled over here. I'm from the area. Can I point you in the right direction? And Joe would say, actually, yeah, we're lost. We can't find our motel. Do you know where this motel is? And this guy would say, oh yeah, I know where that is. Here, give me that brochure and I'll write the directions down for you. So Joe hands the brochure up to him and a pen, and he writes down directions to the motel they're staying in. And then after he gives it back to her, Joe thanks him and he says, hey, would you guys want to come out on my boat tonight and watch the sunset out on the water? It's beautiful. And Joe and her daughters thought, what? This guy's friendly. He's helpful. He seems pretty nice. Sure, we'd love to go with you. And so this guy says, great, I can't wait to see you. And he proceeds to give Joe directions of how to get to this public boat ramp where his boat is. And so she takes notes on the other brochure as he's talking. And then he tells her also, when you get there tonight, look out for my boat. It's blue and white. And so she makes the note blue with white. And after that, she thanked the man not only for giving them directions, but for his generosity to allow them to come out on his boat with him that night. And as he walked back towards his car, Joe and her girls followed his directions to their motel. They got there around 12:30 p.m. They checked in, and then after that, it's not really clear how they spent their afternoon. Whether they went to the beach or a park or something like that, we don't know. But at 7:30 p.m., they were spotted leaving the motel restaurant. And then after that, they went up to their room for a little while to get ready for their trip out on this boat with their new friend. And as they were getting ready, putting their bathing suits on and shorts and jackets, Joe or Christy got out the camera and they took a picture of Michelle as she was crouched down getting ready. And they also took a picture of their view from the balcony out over the bay as the sun was starting to go down. After they were all finally ready, they put everything away in their room, they headed down to their car, and Joe drove them the mile over to
to the boat ramp where they parked. They saw the blue and white boat and their friend was on it waving to them. And then sometime between 8:30 and 9 p.m. that night, the women boarded the boat and the man took them out into the middle of the bay. Exactly what happened out on that boat, out on the water, is not entirely clear. But what we do know for sure is that at some point, their new acquaintance turned on them. And he almost definitely assaulted all three of them. And then after he was done, he tied them all up. He tied their ankles together and he tied their arms together behind their back. And then he put a strip of duct tape over all of their mouths, but he kept their eyes open. He wanted them to see what he was going to do. And then he went into his boat and he pulled out 3 30-pound cinder blocks and he set them on the deck in front of the three women so they could see what he had. And then he got 3 long stretches of rope and he tied one end of each of these pieces of rope to each of the cinder blocks. And after each cinder block was securely fastened on the end of these long lines of rope, he would tie a noose on the other end of each of these lines. So there were 3 nooses and 3 cinder blocks. Then he grabbed one of the women, he stood them up, he put a noose over her neck, he tightened it down, he walked her over to the edge and he pushed her off along with her cinder block. And so as she is struggling to stay above the water, her loved ones are in full view of her. They're watching this happen. And then at some point she sunk below the water and didn't come up again. At that point, the man grabbed another woman, stood her up, put a noose on her neck, tightened it, and then brought her to the edge, pushed her in the water along with her cinder block. And just like before, the last woman on board the ship had to watch as her loved one struggled and eventually sunk below the surface. And then at that point, the man grabbed the last woman, he stood her up, put a noose on her neck, tightened it, and then pushed her off the edge along with the cinder block. And at some point, she too sunk below the surface and did not come up again. And at this point, the man just turned around and drove back to shore like nothing had ever happened. On June 4th, so 3 days after the 3 women were killed, because of decomposition, their bodies had bloated and they floated to the surface. The Coast Guard was alerted to their position. They pulled them out of the water, but because of their extreme decomposition at this point, because of the warm water, they weren't able to ID them. During their autopsy, they found water in each of their lungs, which confirmed they were alive when they were thrown in the water. A few days later, when Joe's car and those notes inside of the car were located near the boat ramp, and the police began to speculate that she, along with her daughters, must have boarded a boat before they disappeared, that was when they made the connection that unfortunately these 3 missing women are probably the 3 unidentified bodies that had been found in the bay a few days earlier. So on the day they make this connection, the police call Hal back in Ohio and they request the dental records of his wife and his daughters. And those records would confirm his worst nightmare. His entire family was gone. The man who killed his family was a guy named Oba Chandler, who was a suspected serial killer who liked to brag about his date with 3 women. In 1994, he was found guilty of murdering all 3 of the Rogers women, but he never took responsibility, nor did he show any remorse. For nearly 2 decades, Oba sat on death row, and not once did he get a visit from a friend or a family member. Nobody wanted to see this guy. And then finally, a little after 4 p.m. on November 17th, 2011, so roughly 22 years after Oba had murdered the Rogers women, he was led into the execution chamber inside of Florida State Prison. After he was strapped down to the gurney, a curtain was slid aside so the witnesses of the execution could see him. And then at 4:08 p.m., Hal Rogers watched calmly from the front row as the man who ruined his life, Oba Chandler, was put to death by lethal injection. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, please tell the like button to go ahead and finish paying for the groceries. You're just going to go outside, get the car, and bring it around to pick them up. But instead, just go out, get in your car, and drive away.